Hello, and welcome to today's Health IT Security webcast sponsored by MedTech Solutions. Your practice is at risk, how to build an always-on cloud security team. I am Vanessa Palmer-Desiato, Project Manager at Xtelligent Healthcare Media and moderator of today's webcast. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MedTech Solutions. MedTech Solutions creates technology systems that work the way healthcare practices work. Their practice-centered care services are supported by dedicated IT care teams to ensure technology systems support essential clinical workflows and strategic business plans. Provider teams to ensure technology systems support essential clinical workflows and strategic business plans. My apologies. Provider applications and full end user support so they can focus on patient care. MTS was founded in 2006 in Valencia, California, and serves thousands of healthcare practices nationwide. The company has been recognized as a 6-time Inc. 5,000 fastest growing private company and a Channel Futures MSP 501 provider, and it has achieved high trust common security framework certification for its cloud platform. We will begin with a discussion by our speakers and conclude with a question and answer segment. Audience members can submit questions at any time during the webcast using the question tool to the left of the screen. A recording of this presentation will be made available following this presentation. For all technical matters or difficulties, click the help icon at the bottom of the screen. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers, Chris Gooch, Director of Engineering at MedTech Solutions, Paul Kayatsa, SVP of Corporate Development and CISO at Advertium, and Steve Lubchansky, VP of Sales and Alliances at LifeOurs. These three organizations, MedTech Solutions, Advertium, and LifeOurs, have also recently announced an alliance that is the first to combine managed cloud services, managed security operations center, and incident response for the healthcare industry. To put today's discussion into context, in the 2020 HIMSS Healthcare Cybersecurity Survey, 70% of the healthcare organizations reported a significant IT security incident in the past year, while cybersecurity budgets are still lacking, with typically 6% or less of IT budgets allocated for security. Healthcare organizations are dependent on technology to provide care for patients, so robust cybersecurity is critical. Today's discussion will address what that means and how you can prepare for a cyber attack to minimize your patients' and your practice's risk. To kick things off, I'd like to pose this question to the panelists. Why are we suddenly hearing so much about cyber attacks in healthcare, and how did these changes affect how healthcare organizations need to think about security? Paul, why don't we start with you?
Sure, yeah, and thanks for having me today. So I'm Paul Kayatso. I'm Senior Vice President of Corporate Development and CISO at Advertium. I have about 20 years of experience in cybersecurity, a little bit more than that. And Advertium is a 24/7 security operations center as a service organization. So we see threats, literally all day, every day. And I think the question you asked, it's best to frame up sort of the threat actor's mindset and their perspective of what they're trying to accomplish. They're seeking to monetize illicit access. And the way that they do that is by getting illicit access to an organization as quickly as possible and attempting to steal data. And what you'll find if you do some research into this is healthcare data tends to be the most valuable data that's sold on the dark web. And also healthcare organizations tend to be soft targets. So if a threat actor wants to quickly monetize data, immediately as possible, they're going to look for those organizations that have the most valuable data and are also subsequently protecting it in a less effective manner, which unfortunately is what a lot of the healthcare organizations that we've helped get through incidents their environment's not as well protected as it needs to be. So I think it's really the balance of those two things. And you see threat actors using new techniques like ransomware as a service, which we'll talk more about, and what's called double extortion, which is the process of stealing data and then encrypting an organization so that the threat actor has additional leverage against them to get them to pay a ransom. So we see these threats escalating continuously, and a lot of it's coming from Russian organized crime or other organized crime that is really focused, again, on soft targets like the healthcare industry. One thing that we noticed over the last year, in October, actually, in the run-up to the 2020 election, there was a very well-publicized campaign or operation focused specifically on U.S. healthcare organizations perpetrated by these same cybercrime syndicates. For those reasons I mentioned, they tend to be soft targets, and they tend to have highly valuable data that can be sold on the dark web and used to gain additional leverage against an organization to pay ransoms. And ransomware is a booming industry. It's highly effective and a great way for a person who lacks any morals or ethics but has cybersecurity experience to again make a lot of money on the dark web. So I think it's really those two factors.
Thank you. And Chris, do you want to share your thoughts?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Chris Goose. I'm the Director of Engineering at MedTech Solutions. I've been in the healthcare industry for over 10 years, both in the acute and ambulatory spaces. I've been with MedTech for a little over six years, and we provide cloud service hosting and managed IT services for healthcare organizations, and provide hosting and security solutions. Vanessa, to answer your question, I think over the last year with the COVID pandemic, I think the landscape has definitely changed. For healthcare providers, everybody's starting to work from home and have remote access outside of the office, and the threat actors have really taken advantage of those things and have really exploited the rushness of getting everything in place for people to be able to work from home. Big challenges for IT departments today are being able to secure mobile devices, bring your own devices, people using their own computers at their houses or their homes, and being able to properly secure those devices and introduce them in safely into the networks that they're connecting into to be able to function and perform their daily duties. So that all those things have introduced major challenges for IT departments today, and the cyber criminals have really capitalized on those vulnerabilities in this day and age, and have capitalized on it.
Thank you so much. And Steve, let's finish with you.
Hi, my name is Steve Lipchansky, and I'm happy to follow these two very smart guys. I'm in charge of sales and alliances for LifeVars. I've been in the security industry for a few decades, and with LifeVars over 3 years now. And LifeVars, headquartered in New York, we are at our core an incident response and digital forensics investigative company. We have services around that, as well as around offensive weapons like red teaming and tabletop exercises and things of that nature. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel with MedTech and Vertium. We formed this triangle in support of clients, especially focused in the medical arena. And being that we're about incident response, I've seen since just I've been with the company several hundred ransomware cases and a huge increase in business email compromise. And the thing about the need for speed in these environments is if a threat actor gets into the infrastructure, and this is before the ransomware gets hit, they want to go lateral. They want to go in and they want to get information, and they want to establish and get entrenched inside the environment. And the quicker you react and the more experienced you are in fighting off these threats is going to save a lot of money. And I'll finish this segment off by saying it's fairly obvious to me after all these events that it's well over 10 times the cost to fight off the threat once it's been established, like ransomware, versus the prevention spend that you can invoke with a group like us.
Thank you so much. And Chris, I want to go back to what you had said. So given these changes that we're seeing, what are the security specialties that healthcare organizations need to ensure that they're protected?
I think from my experience, for organizations to be able to, build the alliance that we've created here with the three of us, there's a lot of different areas that healthcare organizations would have to, bring people in or have people on staff to be able to fulfill these roles. So the first thing obviously is the IT staff. So being able to have IT staff that's knowledgeable of healthcare, of their networks, and understanding of all the tools that they have in place to be able to protect their networks. So that's one role that would need to be filled in this area. The second one would be the cybersecurity specialist. So having somebody on staff to know how to respond to an attack and do it quickly enough to, and hopefully to minimize the severity of the threat. So, you know, there's a lot of specialists out there in IT security that could provide those roles, and then most importantly, you know, those individuals need to know what tools that you're using within your environment. So every environment may be set up a little bit differently. You might be using different firewalls, different AV and EDR tools. So having the individuals that know the particular tools that you're using within your environments is incredibly important. And then the third set of skills that you would need is having an incident response team. So having people to be able to go in and actually remediate the event and perform forensics and guide you through that entire process to get your healthcare practice back up and operational again with the minimal data loss as possible. So I think those are the three key areas where organizations, you know, if they were to do this in-house, those are the three major areas that they would need to cover.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts on that before we move on?
Sure, I can chime in. So I completely agree with everything Chris said. You do have to have, sorry, Steve. You do have to have, you know, your bases covered, right? So, you know, first off, you need to understand the environment inside and out. All the technical controls that are in place to, first off, service the organization and actually keep the business operational. But then the security controls on top of that, they're actually protecting the patient data or just simply the operation itself. And there's a variety of ways that you can do that. And I think from my perspective, I always look at it from, what are the threats that we're actually trying to combat? And what are the typical tactics, techniques, and procedures that the threat actors actually use? Because that will inform the security controls that we want to use to actually help the organization ensure that they are protected. And again, going back to some of those threats, if you think about ransomware, for instance, the statistics really bear out that you have to focus on that one specifically. And Steve actually commented around the lateral movement and things like that the bad guys are actually trying to do. So they'll gain that initial footprint in the environment and try to, proliferate out throughout the rest of the environment so that they can steal data. And there are calling cards to that sort of activity if you know where to look and you've got the right tools in place to be able to see it. I think first off, you always want to be focused on trying to prevent what you can prevent. And the way that you would do that is through that age-old concept of defense in depth. And there's two other security concepts that I really focus on, which are need to know and least privilege. Privilege access management is in a security discipline that I think a lot of organizations get wrong. Unfortunately, you might see overprivileged accounts or accounts that have more access to data that they should, that they really need for the business purposes. And if you think about hardening the environment as much as possible, things like that really make a big difference, and they aggregate into a much more resilient and much more robust security architecture. So you have to be thinking about it from that perspective. And again, it starts with knowing your business, knowing where the data exists, and knowing what threats are coming after you to be able to prevent against their eventual entry into the environment. We can talk a little bit more about how you actually detect these sorts of threats in a minute, but I'm sure Steve's got some thoughts in addition to what I just described.
No, just a final thought. You could hear the expertise that Paul and Chris bring, and the problem out there is that the threat actors outnumber the people trying to fight them by like 1,000 to 1. And it's getting worse and worse. And it's very, very difficult for companies to have that expertise in-house, right? So you need to have the specialists, right, come in. And it says, just like if you tear your meniscus on your knee, you go to the hospital for special surgery, right, for the orthopedic surgeons for those specific issues that you're having. And that's kind of what we bring to the table, that expertise. And hopefully these kind of things don't happen all the time, right? Ransomware and business email compromise. So you just need to have, you need to be aware that really these are highly specialized individuals and companies that help the healthcare industry specifically in these times.
Thank you all for your thoughts on that. And I'm going to direct this next one to Paul, but feel free if you guys have thoughts too to jump in. So Paul, what kind of threat detection and protection techniques should healthcare organizations look for?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and there are a lot of ways to skin the cat, but there's only a handful of really effective ones. First and foremost, like I mentioned, I think the key thing is defense in depth. Have good controls at the various different levels of access to the environment, starting at the network edge. Think about it from the outside in. So you've got obviously firewalls that are protecting your network boundary. The problem with that, though, is, and Chris actually touched on this, the pandemic and the proliferation of work from home or work from anywhere has sort of negated the effectiveness of the firewall, because the perimeter of your network is now wherever your endpoints are. And most organizations, when they shifted to work from home, they adopted a architecture called split tunnel VPN, which basically means my corporate traffic is going to traverse a VPN tunnel back to the corporate environment. But if I need to interact with the internet for non-corporate purposes, I'm just going to go straight to the internet. And that also gives the bad guys that same vector to get in onto that device, which can then pivot over to the rest of the environment. So you need to think about just secure architecture to begin with, because you can't really secure something that's the foundation is a little bit shaky. But regardless of that, other things that you need in addition to just a good network architecture and good boundary defenses are endpoint detection and response. So Chris actually mentioned EDR earlier. This is the much more advanced means of protecting an endpoint. I think a lot of organizations are still using traditional endpoint protection with antivirus, and it's just simply not effective. This is an absolute, you need to be looking at implementing an EDR solution for a variety of very technical reasons that I can get into if we'd like. But effectively what it allows the good guys to do is prevent the more sophisticated attacks that we see a ransomware operator trying to actually make work in an environment. The ransomware operators use techniques that we call living off the land. So what that means is they're going to use legitimate credentials that they may have compromised or they may have found on the dark web. And they're going to use legitimate administrator tools to then enumerate an environment. The tool that's used is Ad Finder or AD Finder, which helps the bad guy enumerate in our Active Directory environment. That is going to look like normal administrator activity to the less sophisticated security organization. So that's where expertise comes into play as well. And this isn't just about tools. It's about people, probably more importantly than tools. But the tools really need to support those people making good decisions as to what's risky and what's not. EDR is a critical one. Another really critical one is a SIEM, a security information and event management platform, which for those that are not familiar is a way for us to capture all of the information about what's happening in an environment, all of the event log data, all of the network telemetry that might substantiate a disposition from our perspective that something's a risk or not. From a real-time monitoring standpoint, so that we can very quickly alert a customer, contain a threat, and then move into response mode. But it's even more important in the response effort itself, because what you'll find if an organization, having done many incidents, right? So if an organization doesn't have this, there's not a really good central way to inspect forensic artifacts that might support the investigation that an organization like Steve's team might do, which really constrains the responders' ability to understand what happened. So the combination of these tools really support a preventive focus that's backstopped by being able to detect that which slips through and then respond to those threats, which unfortunately we are ultimately going to have to respond to. It's critical to understand that even if you've got all the stuff that I described, some percentage is still going to get through, right? Whether that's a business email compromise, to Steve's point, or a piece of malware that lands on a device, which is going to happen all the time, right? We see it all the time. It's what happens after that matters, right? So that initial piece of malware may try to execute a ransomware script, or it may try to move laterally, to Steve's point. You want to be able to stop that. And the way that you do that is through implementing some of the technology that I described, but again, applying expertise to it. And that's the critical element.
Yeah, so I had the same top two, Paul, EDR and SIM. And the last point you made, right, just at the end there about the expertise around it, because you could be deploying what you think is the right EDR solution, but if it isn't tuned properly, right, for the specific industry you're in and the type of attacks that are going on, that could be a problem. And I'm surprised I'm the first person who's going to mention that data exfil, but when Paul talked about the need for SIM and logs, that's really, really important when doing the forensics, where there might be the need to regarding regulations and all, as you all in healthcare understand, those logs are really, really important for the forensics on data exfiltration.
Great, thank you. And Paul touched on this a bit too, but Steve, if cloud and security protection and data resources are doing everything right, why is incident response even needed?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's so many analogies about it. The Avertium and LifeR CEOs are great at analogies. So why do you get a tune-up for your car? Why do you go and once a year get your brakes checked? It's to avoid the big problem. So we have several retainer clients, dozens and dozens of them. And I can remember one time in the last 3.5 years of the customers that we have that had a retainer and didn't use the hours that they had within that retainer to do proactive measures, offensive measures, and for cyber hygiene. And I don't remember one time where they've had a big problem. The ones that have the big problems are the ones that don't prepare properly. And, Paul and Chris know this all too well. I'll take 30 seconds out to give a recent example. Paul had mentioned that there was the Department of Homeland Security came out with an alert in the fall of last year. There was hundreds of healthcare institutions that were hit by all sorts of attacks. We had one call come in through a legal firm that we know. Call came in. This company has a healthcare institution, a little less than 1,000 employees. Didn't have any EDR. They had some old AV in there. They didn't have a SIM, no logs at all. They never performed a tabletop exercise. They never got a incident response plan together, and they got hit with ransomware. And the ransom note was asking for $4 million, and they ended up spending $2 million on redoing their entire infrastructure at 30 locations, as well as only getting paid for half of it by the insurance company because of the way that it was handled, the way the infrastructure was before. So the things that we're talking about here about cyber hygiene and doing all the right things is to avoid what I would call the big problem. Just about everyone's going to have small ones. It's not if but when, right? Life's a breach. That's my CEO says that all the time. But avoid the big problem, right? By taking care of those items so that you don't have a full ransomware attack and your reputation and funds are greatly reduced.
Thank you so much. So this next question, I kind of want to open up to everyone. How does the concept of shared responsibility affect organizations' decisions on cloud hosting and security partners, and what should they expect? Chris, we can start with you if you're ready.
I think the biggest point of that is the shared responsibility is that it takes all parties to be involved whenever you're dealing with an incident. And I think the biggest thing, in my opinion, is that you don't want to be scrambling at the last minute in the heat of the moment of the incident to be able to have to coordinate all the parties together and bringing in individuals or organizations that might not necessarily know your networks and your organization right then and there on the spot. So there's a learning curve for everybody that have to walk into a brand new network and learn the environment. So I think it's a really big advantage of having like an alliance between the MedTech and Avertium and LifeR's is that customers have that assurance that we know that their networks are secured and we understand their networks and we know where their data resides. And if there is an event, then all parties are involved and we are already familiar with your environment and your network. So I think that's a big advantage because I've personally witnessed incidents that have come up, and multiple parties have to come out of the blue and meet each other, and everybody has to get acquainted and figure out where everything's at, and all those types of things. So and that's wasting crucial time during those initial part of the events. So it's nice to be able to have that uniform approach whenever there is an incident.
Perfect, thank you. And Chris, do you want to share? I'm sorry, Steve, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, just a couple quick ones, and one of them is, we do business with other MSSPs as well. No one does it like Avertium does from a standpoint of conducting the orchestra. So what happens in these incidents that occur is that we're on a call. The people on the panel understand this, but there could be 20, 25 people on the call from multiple different departments, companies, you name it, when these things occur. The business people, the technical people. And what Avertium does is really great, that they have someone conducting the orchestra. They push someone out front who really keeps everyone in line, keeps things moving, makes the time efficient and quick, and really does it right. A lot of others in their industry do not have that, where they're mostly throwing it over the wall, where Avertium really is great, and the connection that they have someone like a Paul on staff, right, who understands incident response and forensics as well, is really, really important, so that we have this very smooth handoff of information and also speed that's really important in trying to stop the threat.
Thank you. And Paul,
you're making me blush, Steve. Appreciate those comments. Yeah, sure. So I completely agree with Steve. It's absolutely a collaborative approach, and when we're in sort of dire straits, people are having effectively the worst day of their professional careers from a technology standpoint. It really takes cool heads and experience and just muscle memory of helping guide that customer through the incident. And certainly Steve's team is excellent at that. And I know for a fact that Chris's team at MTS is also exceptional at that, because to Steve's point, there really does need to be in a team approach, right? It's an orchestra, and all of the different instruments have to be played at the correct volume at the right time and on the right beat in order to produce the music. And that is absolutely important. I think one of the key things is being able to articulate not just the technical risks that we're looking at, but also the legal risks, the business risks, and things like that the business leaders will need to understand. Especially in the middle of an incident, you're going to have C-level people on the phone that are much less familiar with the technical nuance of what might have happened. And you need to be able to translate all that stuff into something that matters to a business person. And fortunately, the group that we've put together here has the operational expertise to manage these organizations, and that's the MTS side of the house, and ensure that they're the architecture secure, all the stuff that I mentioned with respect to those preventive controls are in place. You get a team like us that's able to identify when something fishy is happening, be able to escalate that, and hopefully address it immediately without requiring some massive incident response effort. But if it does, bring in the experts that Steve's team has at LifeHours, and it really does work well together. We've seen that in practice quite a few times at this point, and I think it's much to the benefit of the customer to have that collaborative approach. And it really, it's not just us that's collaborating, but we need to collaborate with the customer as well. Often in an incident, you'll find that, like I said, people are having the worst day of their professional careers. Their hair's on fire. They don't really know what to do. They need guidance. They need direction. And that's where, we come in, right? So we're able to, point them at those things which are going to be the most impactful to getting them back to operations safely and securely, understanding what happened, and really guiding them on the best way to manage risk down to an acceptable state from there on after.
Great, thank you. And I want to make sure we touch on this too. Paul, how should a healthcare organization plan and practice their response to a security incident?
Yeah, like I said, muscle memory is absolutely critical. Practice is critical. The way that we like to do that, first off, there needs to be an incident response plan. That incident response plan should document some of the stuff I just described around communications, who needs to be in the loop, when an incident's declared, what is an incident. But what that incident response plan is intended to inform is what happens when that worst day happens. And the way that you're going to vet whether or not that incident response plan is effective is something called a tabletop exercise. And the tabletop exercise is an opportunity for all of the different members of that team, right? So it might be somebody from MedTech, somebody from Avertium and LifeVars, of course, as well as that specific customer and their technology and leadership teams coming together and effectively doing a table read of the incident response plan. So putting a scenario out there, like let's say, we get hit by this specific strain of ransomware, or this user's phished and downloads a piece of malware that then moves laterally through the environment. There's some scenario that we're going to test against. And the participants in the incident response plan generally, shouldn't know the scenario in advance because we're testing what happens. So you have to think on your feet. So there's effectively somebody commanding the tabletop exercise that is going to inject various different circumstances into the scenario that's going to change or affect how the organization and the team should ultimately respond. And that's what we're walking through. So we're going to learn a lot about how effective we are at organizing around solving a problem. And the lessons that are learned from that will be fed back into the incident response plan. So next time it happens, or if it happens in real life, we're prepared to actually prevent the incident from becoming a major crisis. And that's, I think, to Steve's point earlier, everybody's going to have some minor incident that's going to happen. First up, you need to be practicing for that so that it doesn't blow up into something much bigger, much more damaging, and much more difficult to overcome.
Perfect, thank you. And before we open this up to some audience questions, what guidance can each of you give in terms of preventative actions healthcare organizations should put in place immediately to improve their security posture? Steve, why don't we start with you?
So the first thing is make ongoing cyber hygiene offensive improvements by making it a process, not a one-time. So Paul just brought up a great item, right? A tabletop exercise. That is, to me, one of maybe the most effective way to prepare. It's just like doing any exercising of any kind, right? That's why it's called an exercise. But if you just do it once a year, I don't think it's effective that way because of the changing landscape and the changing threats and things of that nature. But there's really something else that I think is really simple. And that is there's a CISA ransomware guide that you could get online that is, I think, should be the Bible for companies that are trying to understand all the different aspects that you need to be understanding and experienced in and learn it in order to really prepare for events like ransomware attacks, business email compromise. It is a really holistic document that gives you a lot of great insight. And also, one other thing I think that's important there is to learn the vocabulary. So things, if you are under attack and bring in companies like us to help you, it's really important to understand the words that are spoken, the technical terms and things of that nature. And within that CISA document, it's just a really great document to really understand things, and then work with the medtechs of the world who are the healthcare, specialists, right? That can also take that to another level. And that was a softball over to Chris Gooch.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think from a technological aspect, there's several things that organizations can do today to prepare themselves or to help, lessen the blow, so to speak, of an event. I think from my perspective, the first thing is assessing your backup infrastructure. With ransomware today, with it spreading over the entire network. I don't know how many instances we've seen of backup.
Uh-oh.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I believe we lost his audio.
It's okay. I can chime in. I think he was heading in a direction which I can pick up on anyway. One of the things that you need to be thinking about in the event of an incident is what to do, from a technological standpoint immediately. First up, we want to try to prevent it if we possibly can. A lot of the stuff that Steve talked about with respect to hygiene is really, really important. Doing things like vulnerability scans and remediating vulnerabilities as they appear in the network is super important, because the bad guys will try to leverage vulnerabilities. But I think also ensuring that the network is segmented properly. And this is something that, when you're operating with a cloud provider like MedTech, a lot of that's done for you, at least on the cloud side of the house, but maybe not necessarily on the on-premise side of the house that you maybe have an internal team that's operating. So that segmentation is really important, because it will help contain that minor incident from becoming something really, really significant, which again is super important. But if let's say you do have a ransom situation that you're identifying. It's actually this happened literally yesterday. I was on a call with a customer, and they were explaining some things that they were seeing happen on the network, and some findings that they had for attack tooling that was resident on the environment right now. And my recommendation, based upon what they were saying, was start shutting off your backup servers, start shutting off domain controllers and things like that, which are the critical components of a network. Because if a backup server becomes encrypted, you're going to have a very, very hard time actually recovering from that incident very quickly. So that's a super important thing. Know what to do immediately. And some of the stuff that Steve described around the CISO, what to do in a ransomware situation, super important to have read and understand and incorporate those sort of perspectives and standard operating procedures into your incident response plan, which is, again, what we're ultimately trying to drive. We want to drive muscle memory. We want to drive practice through those tabletop exercises. We want to do those at least annually. I personally think it should be done more frequently than annually, but at least annually, or if there's ever, significant change to the technology environment, those are all really, really important. And then, like I said, the preventive stuff is critical, but you have to have the telemetry to be able to detect a breach. And that is event log data. That is data coming from an EDR platform. That's network telemetry of what sort of traffic is happening on a network at this moment in time. That's also, things like firewall logs, which is probably going to be obvious to a security professional, but you want to understand, what data is moving in and out of the network, because, obviously that's going to be a way that an attacker might be able to get in. All of those things together need to be brought into, something like a SIEM, like I described earlier, which gives us the ability to correlate events, match that against threat intelligence, which is another really important piece of telemetry, which will help us identify, what threat actor we're working with, what ransomware variant, if it's ransomware, or what malware we're looking at, and ultimately inform the likely tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're going to see along an attack chain. And hopefully stop them at some point in that attack chain before they actually accelerate to their objective, which might be encryption, might be data exfiltration, a lot of different ways it can go. But I think we got Chris back, so maybe Chris can pick up where he left off.
Yeah, sorry about that. One thing I was going to mention was around assessing backup infrastructures. I think the biggest thing for organizations today is to really look at your backup infrastructure, make sure that everything is functioning properly, making sure that you're testing your backups regularly, making sure that that they're timely and then they're meeting the RPO, RTO objections that your company has defined. And then most importantly, making sure that they're air gapped, making sure that they're separated from the network and kept away from any kind of ransomware that could sprawl into those areas of the networks. I think those are probably the key things that organizations can do today to mitigate threats from the beginning.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you to those of you who joined us for today's discussion. We hope you found it helpful to understand the importance of multiple security specialties and what those specialists provide, how to plan and practice your response to a security breach, and ways that you can improve your security posture and defenses. As a thank you for participating in today's program too, MedTech Solutions has entered all registrants into a drawing for a chance to win a free phishing simulation assessment. One lucky registrant will be selected at random to receive the assessment, and the winner will be informed shortly after this webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. So we'll now move on to the Q&A portion of the webcast. As a reminder, audience members, you can submit your questions using the question tool to the left of the screen. So I've seen we've already got a few questions coming in. So let's start with this one. What impact will doing security right have on the physicians, clinical teams, and support staff? Is there a learning curve for them, or will it be completely transparent to them?
So I can chime in on that. So the goal of security is not to say no, it's to say yes safely. So will often require some behavior changes for the users. Things like multi-factor authentication are going to be a slight change in how a user interacts with their systems, and that's something that's super important, especially if you're dealing with PHI or PII. So there are some things that will need to be changed, but by and large, the magic happens a little bit behind the scenes. So we're not seeking to disrupt people's daily lives. We're just seeking to better protect the data that ultimately we're responsible for. We're stewards for. We just the same as we're the stewards of our patients' health. Right, it's the same thing for their data. We need to do the right thing to ensure that it's protected at all times. And while there might be some minor behavior changes that need to happen, it shouldn't be terribly impactful. I think the key things that I mentioned, multi-factor authentication is probably going to be the biggest user impact. Second, maybe to strong password policy. So having a long password with multi-factor authentication is generally going to be the best way to prevent credential theft. And sometimes those things can be a learning curve for some users, but it depends upon the maturity of the organization.
I think phishing training, just on top of that, Paul, is huge too, right?
Sure.
And again, that's just some training courses, nothing that should impact them, right, doing their job, right? Just a couple minutes here or there saves a lot, especially these days. I mean, the FBI just came out with that business email compromise is 64 times more pervasive than ransomware today. So that's a big deal too.
Yeah, and to add what Paul said earlier, I think the biggest aspect from a healthcare standpoint is having a partnering with a healthcare MSP that understands healthcare. I mean, there's a lot of MSPs out there that are just generic and don't necessarily have healthcare experience. But with us at MedTech, I mean, we understand healthcare. We understand the clinical workflows that your staff does day in and day out. So we, obviously we try to conform things to or implement things in such a way that that it's less impeding for your users. So that's one thing that we pride ourselves on at MedTech Solutions is that we kind of build those solutions geared around the workflows that your staff perform every day. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean there are things that like MFA that will be impactful to them, that might be new and be an extra step, so to speak, for them to go through. But our job in MedTech Solutions for customers is to go through those those solutions and try to build them around people's workflows as much as possible.
Wonderful, thank you. Your next question. When an organization moves to a cloud infrastructure, how does it affect their vulnerability? What do they need to consider when moving to cloud?
I can take that one first. So the organizations, when they move to cloud infrastructure, it's really kind of no different than on-prem. So I mean, the type of security infrastructure that you're going to have in place is going to be relatively the same. It's going to be deployed maybe in a little bit of different manner. I mean, when we implement our networks, in our cloud, we're rolling out EDR. We're rolling out advanced next generation firewall technologies. You're rolling out SIEM products, all those types of things that we've spoken about throughout the call. So I think, from that aspect, it's actually beneficial for organizations because they get that economies of scale. For organizations to put all those things in place on an on-prem installation can be pretty expensive. So whenever they move things to the cloud, you get that economies of scale, and things are a lot more affordable in that regard. And then you're getting top-notch security for things that you might not be able to necessarily afford or even achieve with on-prem installations. So.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So I do agree with everything that Chris said, and I think one of the challenges I see people sort of try to overcome when they're wrapping their head around cloud and migration to cloud. Think about a cloud environment just as somebody else's computers. That's really all it is. Take your on-prem computers, put them in somebody else's infrastructure. They're managing a lot of aspects of it. You're managing the data and the interaction with the data. The data is the critical part for this, right? So that's what we're trying to protect. Of course, the operation needs to be protected as well, but ultimately it's that data needs to be secure and accessed only by the people that really need access to it. So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, a lot of what a migration to cloud boils down to is privileged access management and information governance. So understanding who has the ability to impact data, who has the ability to read that sensitive data, maybe move that data out of that cloud environment. Those, I think, are really key elements to think about when you're thinking about a cloud migration strategy. And then what will happen is these security controls to enforce what you found for that data protection strategy will sort of on the model that you've purchased. There are a couple different cloud models like infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service. And to be one of those makes more sense than another. In our experience, especially in the healthcare industry, the customer needs to focus on helping their patients, right? And doing the things that physicians and care providers typically do, leave the IT to somebody else. And that's where, a full implementation like what MedTech has really makes a lot of sense for that customer. They get the economies of scale that Chris described. They also get the security controls and security monitoring that an organization like us provides. And they don't necessarily have to really think about it or understand necessarily, how the sausage is made. They're consuming the product of, an effective security architecture and security environment. And that, I think, is the key thing. So if you're thinking about the cloud migration, you're thinking about moving the data, understanding who needs to access that data, and then how to protect the identities of those user accounts that are actually interacting with the data. Those are key things from my perspective.
Well, you heard it from the smart guys. I just have one experience recently where a large financial institution had a hybrid scenario, some cloud and some not, and had a security issue. So just looking at the question again is what should you be careful of? I think during the migration, and if you have a hybrid, to make sure that you have the security locked down properly as well.
Yeah, I'll say actually most organizations that we interact with these days have a hybrid. They have some element of on-prem and some element of cloud. And that is a really, it's a nuanced point, Steve, and it's definitely something to think about because ultimately the security architecture, sort of the security enclave and how we address security organization-wide, it should be applicable to that entire environment, whether it's on-prem or cloud. In a hybrid cloud situation, you might have, again, some infrastructure hosted by a MedTech, for instance, or you might simply have some systems in a data center and then also be a user of Office 365. You're a cloud consumer in that case because Office 365 obviously is cloud hosted. And that hybridity is very commonly the case. A really important thing in a hybrid environment is that the security operations center that's providing the threat detection aspect of this has complete visibility and you've got complete coverage because I need to be able to see from an analyst perspective what's happening on-prem, what's happening in the cloud, mash that stuff together to get a good picture of what organization-wide security looks like because otherwise you've got blind spots and blind spots equate to incidents.
Thank you all for your thoughts. The next question is, what concerns and roadblocks have clients raised for putting off security enhancements?
Well, I'll start with this one. I'm sure the other guys have some thoughts too. Often I hear budget. Of course, budget's a concern for every organization. Nobody has infinite resources. That's probably the most common one. And I think, unfortunately, without being too strong in my words here, it's a little bit of short-sightedness because and Steve actually touched on this, the amount of money that typically gets spent in an incident response scenario far exceeds the money which would have been spent just doing it right in the first place. And we've had to have that conversation with so many C-level teams and customers dealing with incidents. I can't even tell you. It's basically every time we go into an incident, we have that exact conversation. So budget's really, I think, the number one that I see in terms of an objection. Sometimes we just don't have the resources, from a personnel standpoint to be able to do this adequately, or we don't have the skill set. And that's, to us, that's the catalyst to working with an organization like the collective group that we've assembled here, because we have that expertise and we can make it accessible to the customer, because there's such a huge shortfall in cybersecurity talent right now. And I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. In fact, I think it's probably going to get worse as the threats continue to accelerate. So not having the skill set is sort of, an excuse that we can combat through partnership. So I think that's a key thing. And just one last one for me, and I'm sorry if I'm stealing the thunder for the other guys, but I think a lot of the objection that I've seen from improving security as well, we got this checkbox compliance, we're proven to be compliant. Isn't that enough? And unfortunately, it's not. Compliance doesn't equate to security. And I've seen time and time again in healthcare and other industries where an organization is purported to be compliant, but still has a major incident. And there's a disconnect there, obviously. So that's I think the other big objection that we see. So.
Yeah, and to echo what Paul said, I mean, I think cost is a really big concern for organizations, because I mean there has to be there has to be a large investment made by the organization. But as Steve mentioned earlier as well, it's more costly to do it after the fact than it is to actually prevent it. So, I mean, that's one thing that MedTech has really partnered with these two companies, is to embed that security solution into our service. So then that way you have the experts at your hand to be able to bounce ideas off of, or be able to react in a quick manner if your environment does get attacked. So I think that's probably one big advantage of having like a partnership like the three of us to be able to have that in your hosting.
Yeah, I think it's budget for the most part here, right? And being able to properly present to executive level, board level individuals what it is that you're up against, right? And there's so many examples of it now, and I'm seeing more and more companies involved in proactive means. So if you don't see what's going on out there, or I live in Connecticut. I pick up the New York Times. Every day there's some other cyber issue. So yeah, I say it's all about budget for the most part, just fighting for things. So you take do it little by little, right? Bite off a piece at a time if you have to.
Perfect. Thank you all for your thoughts. What about the integration of crisis management during a cyber exercise? Because this is one area that many don't address within an incident response capability.
Yeah, crisis management is absolutely a critical thing. So, in a situation where PHI has been lost or PII has been lost, there are privacy rules in, at least in California and Virginia at present, and there's going to be 17 more individual state privacy regulations, in addition to obviously things like GDPR, which require notification. And that's a major reputation impact that I think organizations need to be thinking about. So certainly crisis management should be part of the plan. And you should have some, prior relationship with a PR firm that's, dealt with breach response and dealt with, again, crisis management scenario. I think the other thing to be thinking about when you're talking about crisis management is the legal aspects of like the notification stuff that I described. So it's also important, in addition to having partnership like what the three of us have, to have outside counsel or legal counsel that can advise the organization on their legal risks from a litigation standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, et cetera. And that's an element of crisis management that I think a lot of organizations sometimes overlook. It's really, really important to have that relationship in advance. Because if you think about what happens in an incident, right? So time is of the essence. And if our recommendation collectively is you need to talk to an outside attorney that is experienced in a data breach, there's things like conflicts checks, which you have to go through that could take 24 hours or more. And that time is critical time, that early time in the incident. You can't have a lot of lag time in that process, which is why these relationships need to be brokered in advance, crisis management being one of those as well.
Yeah, those are really good points. The reputational aspects of things, and also law enforcement, which I'll get to in a second. So the thing to do, especially when we talked about tabletop exercises and crisis management, is weave that into it, but potentially do it separately, right? So you don't have to have a tabletop exercise. We have all the people about the technical staff, and then you have the management team, and then you have the crisis management team. You can do them in separate tabletop exercises. And actually, we're about to do one with a company in a couple weeks that we're going to have an FBI agent on it, just for the law enforcement aspects of things. So there's different ways to do it, and that's why we talked about that it isn't just one, right? It says multiple steps. But I think it's really, really important point that was brought up here, the crisis management team, especially in a ransomware attack in a regulated industry, for sure.
Fantastic. And we have time for about one more question. How has telemedicine and the use of video platforms affected security?
I can kick that one off. I think telemedicine, especially over the COVID pandemic, was definitely definitely pushed out by a lot of healthcare providers last minute. I mean, there's a lot of healthcare organizations that have been using telehealth and telemedicine for several years now, but a lot haven't. So I know, like, whenever the first several months of the pandemic and the lockdowns occurred, a lot of healthcare organizations were scrambling to come up with telehealth solutions and integrate them into their systems and such. So, and unfortunately, and when you're in situations like that, sometimes security takes a back seat. So, we really stress with our customers that, any solutions that you deploy out really have to be evaluated and really have to be assessed. And sometimes even, customers coming to us after they put a solution in place, and we have to go back and kind of doing a reassessment on it to see, did it create any vulnerabilities within the environment? So it definitely was concern, especially in the early months of the pandemic, where everyone was scrambling to get solutions in place. It was definitely, a concern of ours for customers to start opening up access to networks and for people to work from home and all those types of things. So it definitely has changed the security landscape of the healthcare industry.
Yeah, I think one other point to that, really just in support of what Chris said. So, when you have these situations that maybe outside circumstances require very fast movement, maybe it's an incident that you're trying to manage, or maybe it's, a pandemic that the world's trying to manage. Hasty technology decisions can cause problems, and they can really create situations where data is exposed in a manner that you might not have thought through because enough testing was not done, or enough planning around architecture or security controls was performed. So I think that situation definitely occurred with respect to the pandemic response, both from a telemedicine, telehealth standpoint, and the protection of PHI and sensitivity of data in those situations, but also what I described earlier around just network architecture and getting people working from home as quickly as possible was not done securely in the vast majority of cases. And those are situations where really they're ripe opportunities for bad guys to take advantage of, and that's exactly what we've seen happen over the last year.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your insights. That concludes today's Health IT Security presentation. A special thanks to our speakers, Chris, Paul, and Steve, our audience, and our sponsor, MedTech Solutions. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.